Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. We thought we would celebrate Independence Day with a wonderful segment where we find out what were our original independent ventures when the Founding Fathers settled America back during the 1700s. Well, certainly if we go back and we look at what we fought for and the rules that were engaged within the Constitution to allow us the individual sovereign freedoms, we realize that we take a look at today and slowly but surely it seems those independences have been eroded away. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is a full-time writer with the Washington Times magazine. She writes about government and various newspapers and internet news titles. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is our guest, author of the book Police State USA, our guest, Cheryl Chumley. Cheryl, how are you today?
Hey, Daniel, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Now, going from Washington, writing for the Washington Times to something like this, what compelled you to move in this direction?
To write Police State USA?
Yes.
It was basically, well, first and foremost, I'm a mom with 4 kids, and I care deeply about, the direction this nation is taking. And, being at the heart of politics and government for 15 years on local, state, and national levels covering different events and issues and so forth, I've just watched with growing alarm how our country has strayed from our core greatest asset, and that is that our rights come from God, not government. And it's opened the door to layer after layer of government encroachment.
And it's really fascinating, too, that we see what is going on, and it almost feels at times that there's not a whole lot we can do about it, but that's just a matter of trying to take that apathy and curb it into the kind of energy and focus that it takes to actually do something. In other words, get our government to become more accountable for the actions that they're taking.
It is a little bit overwhelming, and I bet that most people in America, at least those outside of Capitol Hill, have a real sense that our nation has strayed very far from its founding father intent. And I think most people want to see some sort of scale back to government powers and authorities. But as you look about and watch the news and look in your own community, it's hard to know where to fight, where to put the effort. And it can become discouraging, but I guess I would just remind that in this nation, it's in our DNA. We are the nation of underdogs that beat off, the Brits, and we constantly cheer those who come from behind. Passion trumps logic, even when all facts point otherwise. Just one person with enough heart and soul can turn the tide in this nation.
Mm-hmm. And usually that's what it takes, too. But let's go ahead and start with something. Now, on the program, we've talked about a great many things that can seem similar to this, and that is the idea that, well, here's the problem, but it seems that the solution is so overwhelming that an individual takes a look at the largeness of it and realizes, well, that's just too big for me. It's not going to make much of a difference if I try to tackle this on my own. We sort of have a sense when we look at a problem that we look at it from a perspective that it's all up to us as an individual to do something about it. So what do? You simply probably don't do anything until somebody else takes the first step. And certainly when you take a look at today's media, which was one of the original watchdogs, if you will, of the government to kind of keep them in check. You do something wrong, they're going to write about it, they're going to talk about it, they may even film it, and it certainly changes things. But you don't see that as much anymore. That just sometimes blows my mind.
It's true. The media, by and large, at least when we're talking about the mainstream media organizations, they have really fallen down on the job in terms of, watchdog reporting, which, that's not a specialty. That's just what the job entails.
Right.
Right? It just seems like more and more reporters are just taking press releases or the government statement and putting it out there without any sort of fact check or countering opinion. But on the good side of that, there's a lot of radio stations out there. Talk radio, especially for conservatives, is a real big market. And, people like you who constantly do stories that counter the mainstream press, your messages are getting out there. And that's why I think there's a real schism between Capitol Hill and the rest of the nation. And the rest of the nation is where the action can occur.
Now, most people, when they take a look at some of the infringements that are going on, we hear things, for instance, about Edward Snowden and the NSA leaks. We certainly hear a lot about drones this day and age. But what I thought I would focus on as I was reading your book is some things that to me seem to be slipping under the radar. In other words, sure, the Edward Snowden leak and the NSA, that's important, but we hear a lot about that. The other thing is the drones and how they're trying to perhaps use that to be able to have surveillance on us as, individuals kind of going out and doing our thing. But I thought that we would focus on a couple of other things that, again, like I said, seem to be sliding under the radar. It's almost as though those other things are that big distraction, even though they're real, that we would focus on some other things. The one chapter that really got me was the one where you talk about, for instance, the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, why that was funny was, did you ever see the movie Evolution with David Duchovny?
No, I haven't.
Okay. You really should check it out. It's actually quite funny. But there's a scene in there where he's got this partner. I can't remember who it was played by, but anyway, he starts running around along with David Duchovny, and they're not even really like police officers or anything like that, but this other guy, he runs around with a badge, and whenever he would step up, he would say, National Geological Society. Like it was some kind of an important title, like he had the power to wield and arrest you. But the Environmental Protection Agency has certainly started doing things like this. Tell us about that.
Well, the Environmental Protection Agency, as you probably are aware, was set up under Nixon, and its basic premise was supposed to put a stop to egregious corporate pollution of waterways and our land, things where people were getting actually killed, innocent Americans getting killed because of corporate irresponsibility and so forth. But what it's morphed into now, and they put this out on their website, this isn't a hidden agenda. This is what the EPA now puts out as its main policy. It's called environmental justice. And what it does is it allows EPA regulators to basically weave their way into any type of policy and political issue based on the premise that all people are created equal. And they use that to regulate any aspect of the environment they can, including those that impact the economy. So the EPA regulators have taken over the whole EPA message of clean air, clean water, and they've turned it into just a regulation nation where human activity and development is controlled and watched by federal bureaucrats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found that so interesting because of the kinds of things they were doing, and the one that really caught my eye the most, and I couldn't believe this as I was reading it, was that of Gibson guitar.
Yeah.
Please tell our music lovers about that one.
Well, I think maybe some people remember how the Justice Department went after Gibson guitar for wood that it imported from overseas destinations, which they have done for years. But suddenly this wood was imported from nations where we weren't supposed to import products from. And it just seemed as if the Department of Justice, citing environmental regulations and using EPA bureaucrats to storm the production factories of this guitar place, shut down business and fined the company. I can't remember the exact amount, but it was tens of thousands of dollars that Gibson had to pay just to get the government to back off. And in the end, it was something that was found to be tied to a political revenge factor, that Gibson had been a little bit outspoken about President Obama, and the suspicion was that this was just a political retribution.
Mm-hmm. And it makes it so fascinating, too, that just like what you're saying, that if you become outspoken against the government, especially this day and age, and who knows, maybe even in the media it becomes very trepidatious to be able to do something like this, you kind of wonder whether you should.
Well, exactly. When you look at what the IRS did to Tea Party nonprofit applicants and conservative group applications, in the last few years, and we're still trying to get to the root of that, it does make Americans fear, hey, if I speak out too much, is the IRS going to be sicked on me? Is there going to be some other federal agency that breathes down my neck?
Mm-hmm. Now, let's take a look at the subtle things. Now, that one's kind of subtle in its own way, but the next one is the giving away of personal information when, for instance, let's say you go to, I don't know, I remember going to a linen store. What is your zip code when I'm going to cash out? I'm thinking, well, what do you need to really care about, what my zip code is? Well, you can take a look at the marketing aspect with most people coming from this particular zip code are buying silk socks versus this zip code, they're buying this, so then they know how to specifically send out mailers and coupons and so forth, as though they're sort of reading your mind about what you're going to do next. But it suddenly starts getting worse and worse, and you actually recounted a story in here about an individual that really went through the ringer when it came to something like that.
Oh, yes. It's important to note that it's not just government that is overreaching bounds. Big businesses are picking up quite a bit in the data arena, and they're starting to inflict huge privacy infringements on Americans, shoppers who aren't even aware of what's going on. I think everybody has been asked for zip codes when they go to a certain store, and in most cases these zip codes are used for marketing purposes. The problem is the store doesn't actually tell you. They're not really forthcoming with why they use those zip codes. And as has been the case, sometimes if you refuse to provide the zip code, the shop clerk can get a little bit combative with it. There was a case where a woman refused to give her zip code, and the store in turn refused to do business with her. They got into an actual physical tussle in the store over this whole zip code issue. It's crazy, but data is big business, and stores are clamping down on their so-called need to gather information in order to compete. And the fear is that shoppers need to be aware their information is being collected at an alarming rate, and you don't really know what stores are using it for, where they're selling it, and for how long it's going to be floating out there.
I know you were also saying that they're getting into the surveillance game. I mean, we've known for a lot of years, there's the video cameras, and to us it makes sense because, well, what if there's a robbery? This is a good way that they could actually focus in and perhaps identify the perpetrators, but they're experimenting with some crazy things, for instance, like mannequins with cameras. That's kind of creepy. It reminds me of an old Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah, it is. It's Twilight Zone science fiction meet reality. There's an Italian company named Almax, I believe it is, that started marketing mannequins for stores that not only have cameras in the eyes, but also equipment in the heads that records audio. And this is not a anti-theft protection device. What it is, it's to record shoppers' movements and conversations to listen and gauge what items do they most like to buy? Where do they pause in the store? At what displays do they take their time? And, that way they can help market their store products to better sell. But the problem is, of course, is a lot of people don't know when they walk in a store, hey, that mannequin is recording me, and not just for theft purposes, to pick up my conversations and use it for marketing.
Mm-hmm. And it even goes even further when you take a look at a lot of the information that's being used from things like, for instance, social media. When you do searches on Google, that they're basically tracking every single thing that you go out and you search for, and it's something they're going to maintain those records for who knows how long. But the question is, it wouldn't be far of a leap and a bound if all of a sudden you were suspected of something. They go, and I don't know what the process is, if they were to go to a Google and say, we would like to go ahead and to, secure the reasonable search on what they are searching for to find out patterns to perhaps put a case together, and so you kind of wonder, well, what can you do about all that?
Well, there have been cases where people have posted, and I do chronicle some of these in my book, where people have posted on their private Facebook accounts, their private messaging service on Facebook, where they've listed, lyrics or anti-government statements or things that, are outside what the government would consider norm of actual conversations. And suddenly there have been police officers at their door, and arrests have been made. And like I said, these aren't cases that are that few and far between. There's been several of them in the United States just in the last 2 to 3 years. And what's happened is people aren't they don't understand how, first off, law enforcement accesses their private Facebook postings. And second off, we have a little thing still in play called the First Amendment, where you are allowed to criticize your government and, say or speak critical comments about your government if you're unhappy with them. So most people aren't aware that those are actually arrestable offenses, it seems, these days. Mm-hmm. Both the FBI and the NSA have programs that they use through the Patriot Act where they can monitor posters on Google, and they can actually monitor your social media correspondences through Twitter, Facebook, AOL. There's a whole list of companies where you are being monitored.
It doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun, especially if you decide to start up a business that's mostly Internet-based.
Yeah, true. Watch out there.
It's kind of funny that way. Now, you talk about the Patriot Act. Let's talk about that specifically, because that was one of those things that just slid right through without congressional process. And boy, that really put some handcuffs on Americans, didn't it?
Yeah, the big thing about the Patriot Act is that it was born out of mostly fear, the need of politicians to act in the face of the terrorist attacks on American soil. The problem with it is that it was a huge document, and it was introduced and passed into law in record time. I think it was just within a week, Congress had brought forth this bill, which some say, how, first off, could you even write that much text in the span of just a few days? Their theory being that this was actually written long ago and government officials were just waiting for the right time to introduce it. And, the second issue was that most in Congress did not even read the act when they passed it. There was no time to. So it was passed, and within the Patriot Act were all these provisions that gave, extra authorities for the National Security Agency and all America's intel agencies to, conduct extra surveillance operations above and beyond what they normally are allowed to do, and in many cases without having to obtain any type of court permission or warrant, which, as you know, is guaranteed in the Constitution, that you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, and law enforcement needs a warrant to search. So because of that, we're living in this society now where government is watching our every move, not just online, but our phones, our email, our texts, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing, too, is that shows something that's really interesting, and that is the erosion of the habeas corpus. Now, for instance, just not too long ago, I was reading one of the reasons that, when we get to the idea of the executive order, which you write about fairly extensively in the book, where the president just basically signs an executive order and reaches into the legislative part of the government and uses the powers that are within that body rather than doing what he's supposed to do, which is to basically say, hey, when you explain the three branches of government in there. And I thought what was fascinating about that is Vice President Dick Cheney was really a huge advocate of believing the president should have absolute power to make decisions without having to confer to the people or to the government. And going back to what he had seen happen to, for instance, Richard Nixon when he was, involved with that. I'm trying to remember what I was thinking of here and kind of lost my train of thought. But the fact is that he was really the component that I think which was the beginning of the huge causes of, sort of what the government's been doing this day and age.
Well, there were a lot of criticisms under the former administration, not just with the Patriot Act, but with how they pursued the war on terrorism. And you mentioned the loss of habeas corpus, where suspects have the right to appear in court, face their accuser, and so forth. And there were certainly quite a bit of critical opinions written about how the Bush administration handled some terrorist suspects. There was the Hamdi affair, the Padilla case, and so forth, where they were accused of basically arresting and detaining what some said were innocent American citizens based on terrorism reasons without going through due process and so forth. And one of those cases was actually settled in favor of that plaintiff, so that there was some actual cause there for concern. What's happened since I guess under President Bush, you could make the case that September 11th was so egregious that they felt the need to do something, where under this present administration, there should be some scale-back motion to some of these powers, and yet there has not been any as of yet.
You know, and speaking of powers, there was a chapter in your book that literally, and I say this to my listeners, scares the hell out of me because of its reality. Again, we've all heard about the Snowden thing. We all know about Google and searches. We hear about drones. This is constantly there, you know, and it's over our shoulder. But to me, that almost seems like that great big distraction for the subtle things that really have teeth. And that is this particular one, which civil forfeiture. I was looking at that, and it just, that one really makes you angry because you see that on a regular basis. For instance, you're driving down the road, perhaps maybe you did something wrong, a little traffic infraction. You're pulled over by the police, and because you believe the right thing to do with law enforcement is to cooperate, you literally could be sealing your fate just trying to give information that you think is useful, and you realize that's really going to be the end of you. Let's talk about what civil forfeitures are and how that all started.
Yeah, you rightly described that as a very scary scenario, and it's made worse.
And it's the subtle one that you don't hear about. That's the thing.
Yeah, and you know what? That's kind of why I wrote my book, because like you said, everybody knows about Edward Snowden, but what about civil asset forfeitures and criminal asset forfeitures? Scary stuff. What it is back in the 1970s, the federal government wanted to ratchet up the war on drugs. And so it put in place powers for law enforcement through the Department of Justice and the U.S. Marshal's Office to confiscate properties of those who were suspected of those properties suspected of being used during the commission of a crime. So in other words, if there was a drug dealer driving down a road making a drug sale, the guy could not only be arrested, but his car could be confiscated because police say it was used to help him commit a crime. And law enforcement was supposed to, regard this as a deterrent. It sends a strong message to other suspected criminals. But what it's morphed into, it's moved away from the criminal forfeiture, where you needed cause and, in most cases, a warrant and an actual accusation. And it's moved into civil asset forfeiture, which has a far lower standard of proof. So that means what you described, where you could be driving down a road, pulled over by a police officer for, say, a taillight out, and the police officer could say that he smells marijuana in your car, and you could be arrested, your car confiscated, whatever property you have in your car, cell phones, cash, anything, will be confiscated also. You get sent to jail. Turns out that you were completely innocent. You know, there was nothing in your car, no proof. There were no charges brought against you. They let you go. But the police can keep your car, your cash, your personal property, and you have to go to court and prove your innocence to win back those properties. It's a huge cash cow for law enforcement because local law enforcement departments are allowed to keep part of the proceeds. They share these proceeds that they make on these asset forfeitures with state and federal entities. So you can see how they have a real, benefit derived from gathering these properties. And it is a huge business. The Department of Justice just 2 weeks ago posted its latest listing of all the forfeitures that have gone forth in the last year, and it's millions upon millions upon millions of dollars. There's hundreds of pages that list all the properties from boats, airplanes, $100,000 cash revenues, cash collections, jewelry, anything you can imagine. And all this property has been, dispersed among the law enforcement authorities, split, divvied up, and people are still fighting to get it back.
You know, and the alarming thing about this, too, that I wanted to point out, Cheryl, was this. Constantly, whenever there is an election, whether it's local or state elections or it's the national elections, when we want to vote in public officials, one of the things that are continuously on the ballot are emergency services, and of course the police services being slid into there. And they're always proclaiming that they're short on money to be able to pay for the manpower to be able to protect our streets. Now, when you read something like this, now there's a thing out there, and this is in line of what we're talking about here, known as Equitable Sharing Program. where the U.S. Marshals Services reported that between 1985 and 2012, the amount of equitable sharing program proceeds that were distributed among all the players amounted to $5.8 billion. Now, that's billion with a B. And that's just the tip of the iceberg about, that has probably been able to be seen and accounted for. But you think of all the other things they're collecting money from. I mean, traffic tickets. Here's another thing that bugs me, too. I was actually pulled over one time because my tags were expired by 29, 30 days, somewhere right around there. No big deal, okay? So generally what happens is an officer might say, well, why don't you go ahead and get that taken care of? But they've changed the game so much, it almost discourages you from driving, and this is what I mean, okay? So I go to court on this thing. Sometimes the judge may feel like, well, I'm going to go ahead and dismiss that, just get it taken care of. Or in my case, well, almost 4 years ago, Daniel, you went through this before, so I think maybe it's time that you need to start paying attention. So my fine was like $45. No big deal. But here's the ugly side of it. Now they're imposing what are known as, it was the fine plus extras they're going to add to the bill as well. So above and beyond the $45 that I paid in the fine, I paid an additional $150 on top of that. So they're adding these things onto the ticket. So forget about the fact that the judge might have caught you a break. Well, this is normally $100, but your driving record's pretty good, so we're going to knock it down to $30. But after the assessments are added, that's another extra $100. So he really hasn't done anybody, especially you, a favor.
Right. Well, it does make you angry when you see all this money flowing into local police, and yet I get phone calls also from local police, foundations saying that my local police department is screaming for revenues. They seem to be doing okay.
Especially when you stand in the courtroom and you've got one other 100 people on the docket that are about ready to get hammered with the same things, and I watched it over and over, and I almost got to where I could do the math. Ooh, $75 fine, okay, I can guess that in the end that's about $235 for that individual there, and it just went on, and I'm thinking, where are these people saying they need money?
Right, right, it's true.
Crazy stuff. You kind of wonder, too, because of some of the stories that you talk about, especially at asset forfeiture, what someone can do about it. I mean, it seems that people come out good, but in the end they've almost lost more fighting back, and I think that's probably what discourages people from thinking they can step up and do something about it.
Yeah, because oftentimes to get back your properties, you need to hire an attorney, and attorneys don't come that cheaply, and depending on the amount that you lost, it may not even be worthwhile. Or sometimes you may be out of state. The ACLU sued successfully in a little town in Tenaha, Texas, because it was discovered that the local law enforcement officials, just on that little short piece of roadway that wove through that area of town, they had been stopping over 1,000 mostly minority out-of-state drivers, blacks and Hispanics, and they had confiscated properties, cash, cars, what have you, illegally with no due cause at all, and all these cases were dismissed where no charges were ever imposed on the people, and yet the law enforcement kept all this equipment and cash. And so the ACLU finally stepped in and sued. They won, and the local law enforcement had to shut down their asset forfeiture program. But in the end, a lot of these people didn't get back their properties because too much time had passed. They went on out of state, and they probably didn't even hear about the ACLU case in the end.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing, too, that you talk about is the fact that here you got a situation, as you were saying, the law was set up that if you had actually committed a crime and they had seized assets, whether it's your cars, cash, whatever it was, that when you were found guilty of that specific crime, then they could hold this stuff. But in many cases, what you were talking about here were people that had their assets seized, never charged for a crime, never even found guilty of anything, and they keep this stuff anyway. And that's the outrage that people should say, what can we do about something like that?
Right, that's exactly what they do. No charges, no crime committed, and yet you've lost your property. And here's why you don't hear about it. Because when you read your local newspaper or you listen to your police scanner, or, you know, if you see the little blotter report in your community newspaper, what happens is these are people who are pulled over for a traffic offense. Or in some cases, maybe it's a drug-related offense. But you don't hear about the properties that are confiscated. You just hear that, you know, Officer so-and-so made a stop at such and such intersection. And then you don't get the rest of the story that these properties were confiscated. But this is going on in your backyard, in your community, and the only way to put a stop to it is to go to your local government officials and ask about the local police department's civil asset forfeiture laws and ask to be kept abreast or to have like a report conducted about how lucrative this has been for the local law enforcement, and then you can kind of gauge from there if an abuse is being committed.
And then hopefully leak it or send it to the right journalist that's got the brass to say, I think I'm going to let this story fly.
Send it to me. Definitely.
There you go. Now, this next one I'd like to talk about again. Let Edward Snowden and all the big media players, you know, talk about that and the drones. We've heard enough about that nonsense. But this one was really funny when I read about this because I had an eerie feeling as I had my first experience with this. I happened to be up in, I think it was Vancouver, Washington. We were taking a look at buying some homes up there, and we went into the neighborhood. We're taken into this neighborhood by the real estate agent, and I'm looking around and I'm thinking, this neighborhood, this area here feels surreally eerie, okay? And it was almost like I was feeling, as I had told my wife at the time, I feel like I've stepped into the real town of Stepford. You know, all the lawns were perfect, but and all this, and so as we were going through this home, and they said, by the way, this is also part of the HOA. Now, geez, at that time I was pretty stupid what the homeowners administration was, or association, excuse me. So I said, well, what exactly is that? And I said, well, you know, this is a great thing that you pay $150 a month. You know, if there's any damages to your roof or your home, you know, they go in, they take care of that. Let's say after a storm, you know, one of those branches from one of those big green evergreen trees drops down. You don't have to worry about that. You know, they could be up to thousands of dollars in damage, but because you're a member of the homeowners association, we take care of that. We take care of the lawns, this, that, and the other. And you think for a moment, boy, that sounds like a dream come true. You know, $150, and they just take care of all the maintenance. So everybody's house in the neighborhood has that ding to it, so to speak. But I started doing the math, and I started thinking, okay, well, that's fine, but it sounds to me like also in a subtle way, this is possibly a group of people that are going to tell you what you can and can't do with your home. Now, tell us about some of this that you write about in the book, because that got ugly pretty fast.
Well, it's funny, your story, because I had a similar one when I moved up from Georgia to Northern Virginia, and my husband and I were checking out properties, and this townhouse lady was taking us through, you know, a local community, and she mentioned that the HOA was pretty open-minded. They even let you plant flowers on your front porch.
Wow, they let you?
Yeah, like you, I hadn't known about an HOA, and you know, my husband and I traded looks, and what is this? But what it is, you know, homeowners associations are basically little power grabs at private property rights, in my view. It's not a government organization, but it is quasi-government. You know, it's set up when you buy a home, people enter into homeowners associations willingly and so forth. But in doing so, you cede part of your private property rights, and you agree to the terms of that community homeowners association. And in my book, I profile just how egregious you know, these boards have become in terms of dictating what residents can and cannot do with their properties. I think we've all heard cases where HOAs say that you cannot hang an American flag outside your front door, but in one particular homeowners association put out a regulation that when you had a visitor to your gated, they had a gated community, when you had a visitor to your home, you were responsible for that visitor's behavior. And I guess the logic behind it was that if your, you know, visitor got drunk and did property damage, then you as the homeowner of that community would have to assume responsibility and pay. But what happened to this one woman, she allowed a contractor to come to her home. The contractor was actually making visits to about 7 different homes homes in the gated community that day. The gate guard let him in. He got a speeding ticket once he was inside the community, and the woman who was listed as his first stop of the day got a $50 fine from her HOA because they have a behavior rule in place that says you have to pay if any of your guests commit any sort of crimes. And, so it's things like these that really drive home the point and the question, why are Americans signing up to such great degree to join an HOA? You're giving up your private property rights.
Mm-hmm. And the big lure, of course, as you read about what the Homeowners Association benefit is that when it comes to reselling your home, they upsell better than other homes. Well, I don't know if that's really worth signing on the dotted line for. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's a flip side to that actually some people are rebelling against the idea of homeowners association homes, and they're actually not selling as fast as some people would like to put out. I think a lot of people, as they become aware of, the zealots that sometimes govern the homeowners association board, they decide no more. I don't want to live like this anymore, and they look for properties, maybe even older ones, that are outside of HOA boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Now, also in line of that particular chapter I found fascinating, too, is that you were talking about zoning and, of course, permits, things like that. Now, if anybody ever started a small business, they would realize that as soon as you even file, you get flooded with a bunch of people with their hands out as though all of a sudden you're into all this money that you're being able to, put out there and lay out there for whatever it is that you want to do. And a case that I thought was pretty funny, and this is a personal one, was a friend of mine who decided to start a restaurant, just a small little restaurant, seating of about 50 or 60 people was the capacity. So he goes down, and this is in Portland, Oregon, by the way, and he was from New York. And so he said he had spent literally a whole day just getting the a single permit to be able to say, this will be a kitchen where I will prepare food. Okay, so he needed a permit for that. So he goes in, he goes to the first, he fills out his permit application, takes it into the clerk. The clerk says, okay, have a seat and I'll be with you in a bit. And about 35 minutes later, he says, okay, it's been approved to go to this next guy. Okay, so apparently this next guy is somebody who double checks what the first guy does. Okay, so he says by the end of it, he paid close to $3,500 for this single permit to ultimately be approved by 6 different people.
Wow.
One permit. And he says, what kind of idiots are going on in this state here? He says, if it was New York City, it'd be a lot different because I would have been approved by the very first guy because they knew that they wanted that business up and running so they could collect taxes on the back end. That just makes sense. But you kind of wonder what other states are doing when it comes to permits and zoning and the like.
Yeah, it's just as egregious all over the United States. I mean, it's, of course there are some local governments that are pro-business and so forth, or pro-development, and they actively seek to draw in new members of their community, and they speed through zoning and permit applications in record time. But there are far more that look at their jobs at the local level to stymie and to control and regulate how developments go forth. And what that means for not just a business owner but an average American is that it's a headache to get any work done, even on an existing property. Now you have permit and zoning regulations and accompanying fees if you want to even put a shed up in your backyard in some cases. A lot of these things are driven by a lot of the regulations are driven by the environmental crowd who just want to make sure that, your shed that you put up is not going to impact some floodplain map put out by the federal EPA. But, by the same token, there's a lot of anti-development in local communities, and the zoning authorities and the permitting people, they have a lot more power than rightly belongs to them in a nation where we're supposed to be a capitalistic free market society.
Mm-hmm. And in light of that, too, it depends on, again, I think sometimes that a lot of this is harder on people who don't tend to have the resources, whether they be legal or financial, to be able to effect what we're talking about here. To give you an idea, not too far from where I live, a brand new, as if it was needed, especially where I live now, a Walmart's going up. Okay? Well, that's just what we need is another Walmart, But the fact is that it's going into a place that used to be a marsh wetland. My question would be, where was the Environmental Protection Agency when all this was going on?
Yeah, well, see, that's another problem with these local zoning and permitting regulations. They're oftentimes very arbitrary, and you can get exemptions for a range of things, sometimes from the state authorities, sometimes at the local level. But the point you made toward these regulations more often than not hurting the lower income people, that's very valid because, wealthier people have attorneys that can fight this. They don't even have to go to the meetings half the time. They just send their attorneys to the local board meetings to deal with the local zoning people and so forth. But the average Joe, they basically have to do this whole bureaucratic dance all by themselves. And not only is it, time off from work and time consuming, but it's also very confusing, overwhelming, and it's just downright outrageous sometimes, the reactions you get.
And speaking of outrageous, nothing seemed to me more outrageous than those 3 girls from Midway, Georgia. Tell us about that one.
Is that the lemonade?
Right.
Yes. Now,
because I pictured, how often do we see the cute little kid on the side of the street selling lemonade? You just can't, how much is it? It's 25 cents a cup, and how about $1, kid? Because you see this young entrepreneur believing in the American dream, as you were saying, and the capitalistic ideal of chasing, your goals and your dreams. But it wasn't so good for these 3.
Yeah, and you know what? These 3 girls from Midway, they are not alone because I've done, I would say, maybe 4 or 5 stories since this book has come out about, similar situations. This is when your local zoning boards, this is a great example of how local zoning really harms the average American. When you're just a little girl and you want to start a lemonade stand, as these 3 girls in Midway, Georgia did, and you are shut down because the local zoning and permitting people say that you did not pay your fee to open a business, that's crazy. That's about as un-American as it can get. I forget what their fee was, but they were supposed to pay something in the range of $50 a day.
Per day.
Yeah, to run their lemonade stand. And who can afford that? If they made $30 a day, just selling lemonade, that was probably a great profit for them. But these types of things, not just the lemonade stands, but there are cases of Girl Scouts trying to set up shop in local communities to sell their Girl Scout cookies, and they're also approached by local zoning and permitting people demanding that they pay a fee to operate a business. This is crazy stuff, and this is all leading toward my basic argument that, America's lost its freedoms, and we're definitely headed toward a police state.
Yeah, there's no doubt, especially when the Girl Scouts who had actually been on a sidewalk, which was the sidewalk in front of a home of the woman who had actually founded the Girl Scouts.
Yes, exactly.
Wait a minute, that's really un-American.
Yeah, you can't make this stuff up.
I know, that's what made it so funny when you read this. But at the same time, as somebody reads this, your book, The Police State USA, you ask again, what can we do and what should we be doing?
Well, there are a few actions Americans can take, and we did discuss at the beginning of the show that maybe people are overwhelmed and it's driving some apathy. But there are some definite actions to take, though they're not overnight solutions. First and foremost, I would say stop funding the major parties. Republican, Democrat. If you look at what's going on in politics the last few years, it does not matter if that person has an R or D next to his or her name. We're getting the same results, and that being that our nation is moving away from its greatest asset. Our rights come from God, not government. So I would say your money is better spent funding watchdog nonprofit type groups that do the real fight for the average American on Capitol Hill and in state political, assemblies and so forth. The second, I would suggest people need to read the Constitution. It takes about a half hour to read that document. And if you do that, at least when you turn on your evening news, you can see just how far we've strayed. And you can say, hey, Founding Fathers said this, but this is what politicians are doing on the evening news. And then you can maybe form a battle plan. And third, I truly believe that our nation was founded by God's blessing. Our founding fathers, turned to the Almighty constantly, and I think our nation should follow suit and turn back the tide and start doing a little bit more praying in terms of asking God to intercede in some of these political and cultural issues.
You know, in religion, boy, you really capture that interestingly in the book. And I remember when I first started paying attention to that was, I don't know, I think it was right around 1999, year 2000. I don't remember when it was, but it was the state of Kansas that started talking about how, well, you know, humans have been around for 8,000 years, and we're going to start bringing the Bible through school to teach our kids right and wrong, this and that and the other, and you're thinking, okay, wait a minute. But it's really fascinating when you write in that chapter about that is that a lot of times the ugliness comes from individual parents that somehow step in on something, for instance, like the Pledge of Allegiance, and feel they've got to make a ruckus out of something like this.
Yeah, you know, when I was growing up, I was taught if somebody says something that's offensive, or if you're an atheist, say, and your local government board opens in prayer, then you just stand politely or even sit down and just let it go. Now it seems like any time there's an offense, any time somebody suffers some sort of, you know, insult or offense, we have to make this huge case out of it and bring it to the attention of the nation, file suit, and threaten all kinds of, you know, actions. And really, a lot of this stuff, if you don't like the, you know, the under God phrase in the Pledge of Allegiance, don't say it. We don't have to make a case out of it, out of every little thing.
Well, it's as you said, and I thought it was funny at the same time when you bring up the idea of the atheist. Well, if you don't believe in God, then what the heck are you so afraid of?
Right. You know, the Easter Bunny doesn't make me upset when Easter rolls around.
They've turned him into an Energizer Bunny, by the way.
There you go.
You know, it's just it's funny, but then again, you know, one might read the book and they might say, well, you know, it looks like she really doesn't like the Obama administration, and a lot of people don't seem to be so much anymore. But the funny thing is how you outline, especially when you talk about the president actually initiating executive orders, and you reach way back, and you talk about a lot of different presidents that exercised this sort of a power, even back to Abraham Lincoln. Talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, I don't like executive orders at all, whether it's Republican or Democrat. I don't see anything in the Constitution that allows them. But the fact is, you know, every president since the founding of this nation has used executive orders. The difference is in how they were implemented. Washington, for example, used executive orders to do what the Constitution called on the president to do, and that was simply to receive, periodic reports from his cabinet officials. So he would issue those mandates to receive these reports, and over time they became called executive orders. The president now, I think, has taken executive orders to the 12th degree, and he's gone way overboard. Everybody knows the famous quote, I've got the pen and the cell phone, who needs Congress, and so forth. And, you know, he keeps doubling down even more. That was not the original intent of executive orders, to simply bypass Congress as if you are a king. You know, and there have been presidents in history who have done that at times, but no president in history has done it as much and to the degree as this President Obama has done.
Now, give us an idea of just a couple of them that he has done that can be pretty detrimental if we don't grab a hold and do something about it, if that's possible.
Well, the current one with immigration is, you know, it's in chaos right now. When he issued the executive mandate saying that certain unaccompanied children and certain immigrants, certain classes of immigrants will no longer be deported. That was certainly a slap in the face, not just to Congress's authority, but also to the Constitution, which mandates, you know, that the president has to go through Congress for laws. He can't just, you know, issue decrees as if he's a monarch or so forth. But what's resulted is the chaos that we see at the borders right now, because when he did that, he basically sent out an announcement to the world, we will not deport. So here you have tens of thousands of unaccompanied children flowing across our borders, and now our federal agencies, our states, and our local law enforcement are being forced to deal with this issue. And meanwhile, Obama's on Capitol Hill just yesterday, saying that he's going to issue even more executive mandates to kick Congress in the butt to get them moving on transportation funding.
Oh, my. You know, and again, the question looms, what is the step a listener should be taking, you know, that can actually begin to change or effect change in these areas?
Yeah, that's why I don't like executive orders, because, the president's not going to take your call. So what you have to do is you have to press your lawmakers, you have to call your representatives and demand that they stay strong and resist, this regulatory, rogue regulatory attempt of the president. And, Congress still has the power of the purse strings. So Obama, or any president for that matter, could issue decrees all day long. But if there's any sort of funding that's attached to carry out those orders, then Congress, specifically the House side, has at its disposal the power to refuse to fund it.
Mm-hmm. So that's a very curious question. So let's say President Obama initiates one of these executive orders, just goes right by Congress and decides to do this, and Congress has that kind of power. It seems to me they would exercise more of their right to say, hold on, buddy, we're not just going to let this fly. Let's take a look at it first. Does that happen more often than it doesn't, or does it happen at all?
Well, the latter, and thus my recommendation: quit funding the main parties. Because, there's only a handful.
Ralph Nader's tried.
There's only a handful that do the real fight for the American people, and they stand alone, and they're torn apart by the media and by a lot of their colleagues also. So, like I said, stop funding the main parties and put your money to work for you, for people who actually fight for the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Now, I will touch on, as we're wrapping up the show here, on drones. Now, we mostly hear about how the military wants to effect using these on surveillance and so forth. But what I found fascinating, and maybe people know about this, or who knows, but Amazon, everybody's familiar with Amazon.com. You go on and you buy and you save for just about anything you can think of. Amazon's working on a drone technology so that they can guarantee, and this is probably a few years down the road, same-day delivery. It's kind of nice when you can buy your designer socks and pretty soon a drone shows up at your door and drops them off. But then again, you got to consider the implications of something like that, because you were also outlining other industries such as agriculture that are using drones. So stepping away from what we mostly hear about, which is military and policing zones, into these, and you kind of wonder which one would be more dangerous.
Right. My prediction is that drones are going to be in the airs regularly, within the next 10 years or so. Congress has tasked the FAA to come up with commercial policies that guide commercial use of drones by 2015, so that's right around the corner. Amazon wants to take the lead, like you said. I think there was a pizza delivery place, maybe it was Domino's or Pizza Hut, that wanted to explore drone delivery of pizzas also. I actually think that the government having drones is scary enough, but what's going to happen is people aren't going to be alarmed by the time government and law enforcement have drones in the skies, because the coolness factor of businesses doing deliveries by drones is going to kind of tone down the fear. I think people are going to become accustomed to drones coming into their homes, to deliver products. And first off, you may not be able to tell the difference between a commercial business drone and a law enforcement drone. And second off, I think, as the new generation comes up, they're not going to be worried about it because they're going to be used to it from the business sector.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes I believe that's one of the big roles that media has played, is that it has gotten us to a point that we are so desensitized that apathy just slowly settles in. Just give me my cell phone, hopefully you'll leave me alone, and I'll just go about my day. And that, having a passive attitude, that's really not the American way.
No, and you touch on a good point, because founding fathers never believed that Americans should just, fall asleep at the watchdog wheel and trust politicians to conduct business, in their best interests. Founding fathers constantly warned about government as power and government as a force, and government needed to have, an alert public, including a very active and aggressive media to keep the government in check. And that's not there. That's not the system anymore, and that is a real danger. When American people are not educated as to what's going on, how can we fight?
Mm-hmm. And as you say so well, especially as you wrap up your book, and there's so much more to this, believe me, listeners out there, pick up a copy because, again, I wanted to point out more of the subtleties that, to me, had teeth. It was, for instance, what was that movie in Tom Cruise? I think it was The Firm. How he finally takes down the firm through mail fraud.
That's right.
It ain't sexy, but it's got teeth.
Yep.
But that's what we were talking about, is these little subtle things that seem like benefits are the very teeth that are going to bite and bleed you.
That's right. They're sold to the American people with a smile, and they sound good, but they're just leading us down a path of tyranny.
So is there hope then, do you see, from your position, and again, just to re-enlighten our listeners here, what we should do, that we can, for one, pay attention, but also take action as well, but what are the proper ways to go about this?
Definitely hope. I mean, America is the greatest country in the world, no doubt about that. Everybody wants to get into America. And, if there's any doubt that America is falling, then why are our borders so porous? There's definitely hope, and I think most Americans, they want to turn back the tide. Like I said, stop funding the main parties, put your money to better work in watchdog nonprofit-type groups that fight for the Constitution. Read the Constitution and teach it to your children, because public school systems aren't. And, remember, our rights come from God, not government. And, in line with that, we should do a little bit more praying to God and a lot less relying on government for the solution to our problems.
And finally, last but not least, speaking of government will take care of you, let's talk a little bit about Michelle Obama. That one was funny.
That's a pet peeve with me, Michelle Obama and her menu for American school children. The biggest problem I have with Michelle Obama telling American students in public schools what to eat is that she's not an elected official. She's married to the president, and she has this massive platform, and she has taken advantage of this platform, not just to suggest or recommend what people should eat to stay healthy, but to push through legislation and to push through regulatory controls at the federal level that usurp parental controls in local school systems and demand that kids eat what she envisions as a healthy lunch. That is something that is so anti-American and so egregious in terms of parental controls. I don't know why that plan has been allowed to stand this long.
Cheryl, and it's too bad that we don't have enough time, because that was one that I also realized really needed a hard look at, and that is our school system. But perhaps we can bring you back, talk about a couple of other things that you've written about here in your book, and much less not the drones or anything like that. We'll leave that up to mainstream media. They seem to think that that's all we want to know about. But again, it's these subtle things that are the ugliest that you don't hear a lot about. Is there a website that people can find out more about this and where they can get your book?
You can go to wndbooks.com or Amazon and pick it up, or you can go to my blog at cherylchumley.blogspot.com.
Very good. A wonderful book, and even though you're raising the alarm, unlike a lot of what I have seen out there, and we've talked about this subject in many different ways here on the program, is that even though you're providing, the scary reality of what's going on, at the same time you're providing the kind of information that allows people to say, okay, I think I know what questions to ask to point me in the direction that will take the action to get us the inevitable outcome that we're all seeking. And basically, it's just to tell these people, look, you're here to protect and to serve us, so quit messing around, would you?
That's right. Remember, politicians work for us, and that includes the president. He's an employee of the American people.
CherylChumley.blogspot.com is where you can find out quite a bit about this as well. Cheryl, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program, and hope that we can have you back again.
Definitely, Daniel. It was great speaking with you. Thank you.
Thank you. We encourage you, the listeners out there, be sure to find out about Cheryl's blogspot. Again, it's CherylChumley.blogspot.com, and if you missed that, just go to Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. You can find out more there as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.